welcome back to Lucy Licorice Art. In this video I'll be showing you how to draft a pattern for a new doll using old patterns and how I then cut and sew the dress from start to finish. The style of this dress is a Lolita, which is a Japanese fashion style that I love. This is a longer video because I wanted to keep it as in-depth as possible, but feel free to skip around when needed. Let's jump into the video. I start by drawing up a very rough sketch of what I want my dress to look like. I looked at a bunch of dresses on Pinterest to get some ideas for a new skirt design and sleeves like this that are puffy. I love to look at Lolita fashion for new ideas on subtle accents that add a lot of detail and fun. Once I know what the dress shape will look like, I make little sketches of the pattern pieces that I will need to make so that I don't forget anything. I'll refer back to the sketch as I go when I need to. I'm starting by making the pattern for the front panel of the dress. Since this doll is a female, I need to add darts to make the bodice more fitted to the chest. I'm using a pattern from a doll that is similar in size since I already spent all the time tracing their body to make this pattern. I have the pattern for this doll on Etsy if you'd like to check it out or use it. I'll leave a link in the description. Otherwise, you can just make your own. I put a piece of clothing that I made with the original pattern onto this doll so that I could see what adjustments I needed to make. This doll is much taller and a bit bigger, so I needed to add length to the bottom and make the darts a bit larger for her small waist. I also needed to extend the shoulders for her taller stature and extend the armholes so that there isn't any puckering in the sleeves. I've already made this dress off screen to work out the issues like testing the fit. But I just try the pieces onto the doll multiple times as I go to make sure everything looks okay before I make a detailed fancy dress like this. Once I've drawn the pieces, I cut them out, and I'm sure to fold in half any cut pieces that are symmetrical, like the front piece and the sleeves later on. To make the sleeve piece, I start by putting the top and back pieces together at the shoulders and trace so that I have the sleeve edge the exact same size as the sleeve opening when I sew them together. Then I can give a seam allowance to the edges and extend it out to whatever sleeve length I want. I'm making pretty short sleeves here. If I wanted regular sleeves, I would just use this pattern, but since I want puff sleeves, I'm going to use this pattern to make a second sleeve type that will be gathered. I look at lots of images online to help me understand how to make this pattern, so I'm just simplifying it here for you. I traced a second pattern piece so that I can still have the original for later on for another project. Then I fold the pattern in half to find the middle and cut there, cutting again about 3/4 of an inch in. Now I have 4 separate pieces. I lay out the 4 pieces about 1/4 of an inch from each other to create that extra distance for gathering. Depending on what kind of puff sleeve you make, this pattern piece will look a little different, but I want a puff on the shoulder and at the end of the sleeve, so I'm going to add to the top and the bottom of the pattern piece, giving a soft curve on each end that will be gathered later on. Also, be sure to label your pieces as you go along so that you can separate them from other dresses and dolls. The last piece I'm going to make is a collar piece. Collars are a little deceiving because the pattern piece actually has to be curved to sit right on the neck. I'm still not an expert at doing collars by any means since I find them confusing, but this method looks decent at least on a doll scale. I trace the neck of the front and back, extending it out and drawing a curve for the front. I make sure to add a seam allowance to the outside for sewing it together and attaching it to the dress. For doll scale clothing, I usually only add a seam allowance of about 1/8 of an inch, but if you find that difficult to sew, you can add more if you need. Now I'm deciding what fabric I want to use for the dress. This can be harder than you'd think if you're indecisive like me, so I'm writing on the sketch what fabric I want to go wear so that I don't waste it later on by cutting out pieces that I won't end up using if I change my mind. Then I lay the fabric out, folded with good sides together. This means when I trace the pieces it will be on the back, and I'll have a mirror image of the pieces that I need two of. This way you don't end up with backward pieces. I only need one front panel, but I still cut out two just in case one of them gets snagged when I cut out the darts, which happens more often than you think. I'm using a Sharpie here so that you can see what I'm doing, but a washable marker for sewing is probably better since it doesn't bleed. You could also use pins. I just find that to be hard with small pieces like this. I tend not to use any pins when making doll clothes since they tend to just get in the way for me. The skirt is pretty simple. It's just some gathered rectangles, so I measure the waist with enough overlap for Velcro, which in this case is 8 inches. Then I times that by 2.5 for the first rectangle that will be the top of the skirt, and then I times that number again by 2.5 to be the second part of the skirt that goes on the bottom. This makes a big fluffy skirt like you'll see later. I wanted to keep this next part in because you can always change your mind as you sew. Even as much as I've made things, I often get into a zone and make mistakes. It's just part of making things. I figured out that I wouldn't have enough of this gray, and I decided that the dress needed a neutral to go with this busy pattern, so I'm going to use black for the other pieces instead. For the black fabric, I use a white chalk marker to trace the pieces. It takes a few seconds for the ink to become visible, so don't break the felt on the marker trying to draw harder. It just takes a minute, no matter how hard you press. I double over the collar piece to cut out 4 at once. In theory, this will make sure that the two sides are more identical when sewn together. I like to start sewing by hemming the back edges that will hold Velcro and sewing the darts in the front panel. You can save time by chain stitching and continuing to sew so that you don't have to keep stopping to cut threads off after every single piece. I like to use a hair straightener to iron down seams since it's more convenient in the smaller surface to use on these small doll clothes. No big iron and ironing table needed with this method. Sewing the collar together is pretty simple. I'm just sewing along the outside end, leaving the top edge open for flipping since it will be sewn shut when I attach it to the shirt collar. I go slow, taking my time to stop and turn to make sure that the curve is going to look nice when I flip it. Remember to keep your needle in the fabric every time you lift the foot and turn. I clip the corners on the collar edge so that it will lay more flat when it's flipped around. You might need to use scissors to help to get the small corners to flip all the way. I then top stitch down the collar to make it stay flat and look nice. I actually find it easier to do this without ironing it down, but if it's easier for you, you can definitely iron it in place before you start top stitching. Now I'm going to jump over to the puff sleeves. I sew along the edge after changing my machine to a gathering stitch, or just a 4 cm wide stitch if you have a basic machine like mine. I leave some thread on the edge to hold on to, taking one thread in my fingers and scooting the fabric along it to gather it up, adjusting it to make it more even. I then hold up the gathered piece to compare it to the original sleeve pattern, since this will show me if I gathered it too much or too little. It needs to be roughly the same size as the regular sleeve to fit properly in the shoulder. If you're worried about the gathering moving around, you can also use a regular length stitch to sew down the gathering for the next few steps. Then it doesn't come unraveled as easily. Once I have both sides gathered, I make sure that I have the sleeve side and not the shoulder side, and sew on the cuff at the bottom that will keep the sleeve puffy. Then I top stitch it down so that it will lay nice and flat. Now I'm sewing the shoulders to connect the back and front pieces. I make sure to lock the stitches well by sewing back and forth, since the shoulders have a lot of tension on them when dressing the doll. Sewing on the sleeves is probably one of the trickiest things about making clothes. I like to start with the middle of the sleeve and sew each side at a time. I match up the middle of the sleeve with the middle of the shoulder, going slow and stopping often to match up the edges of the curve. Then I flip it over to the other side. Then when I open it up, you can see how flat it lays now. Now I'm going to sew on the collar while it's still laying flat like this. I lay it bad side to bad side, since I'm going to flip it over to make a nice seam. Again, going slow around the curves. Now I flip the collar over and top stitch it down into place. Again, you can use an iron to flatten it before top stitching it if it's easier for you. I fold a little bit at the end of the collar and hem it so that it will be in the back and leave a nice clean edge. After trimming off any loose threads, I'm going to start sewing down the side seams, folding the back pieces down to match up with the front. I start with the sleeve to make sure that they match up, since I can always trim off the bottom edge if it's crooked, but I can't trim the sleeves down. I make sure to lock the stitch, since this sleeve will be pulled on a lot when dressing the doll and you don't want it to come undone. Make sure to stop at the armpit to make sure that the sides match up. I also clip the fabric around the armpit so that when it's flipped right side out, there won't be any bunching. Make sure not to actually cut through the thread that you've sewn. Now I can flip the bodice right side out and iron it flat so that I can trim off the excess on the edge, since I want the skirt to start just under her chest. If I don't want it to be high-waisted, I don't have to cut as much off. You can just even it up instead. As many times as I've made shirts and dresses, I always have to even up the bottom edge, since it always ends up just a tiny bit crooked. Once again, the skirt is pretty simple. I'm just sewing a gathering stitch at the top edge of the top piece for later on. Now I'm doing the same to the bottom piece of the skirt and gathering it just like I did with the sleeves until it's the same length as the top piece of the skirt. Then I sew the bottom gathered edge to the top piece where it's ungathered. Then I use the gathering stitch that I sewed into the top piece to gather it up where it will join with the bodice of the dress. I gather it until it's the same length as her waist, which is 8 inches, checking it against the ruler. Now I can sew it to the bodice, going very slow to keep it matched up so that it doesn't get bunched. I cut off the excess, and then just like the sleeves, I top stitch it down so that the skirt will lay nice and flat when it's on the doll. I use white Velcro as a closure in the back, cutting it to the length of the bodice and sewing it on each side, making sure that one is on the back and one is on the front so that they match up when you close the dress. I just sew around the outside edge to make sure that it's nice and secure. Now I match up the bottom edge of the skirt and sew up, but only halfway. There needs to be room for her to get her legs and her butt through the opening when it closes. I make sure again to lock the stitch, since this will see a lot of pulling when you dress the doll. Then I fold down the edges and hem them so that it's nice and clean in the back when flipped right side out. I can finally turn the dress right side out and try it onto the doll. I ended up tacking down the collar in a couple of spots so that it doesn't try to pop up anymore, and I added a little bow to the middle while I was at it. You can also see that I made the skirt a little shorter than intended, but she needs some underwear anyhow. Hopefully you found this tutorial helpful in some way and were able to follow and learn some different tips and tricks that I use when making doll clothes like this. If you'd like some more tutorials on different types of clothing in the future, feel free to leave a comment below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.